10 minutes past midnight. 4 engines howl low over the Rhodesian bush, wingtip lights sliding through the treetops. The left wing catches an anthill and a stand of hardwood, and the aircraft tears itself apart across half a mile of scrub. Fire climbs into the black canopy. 16 people are aboard. Nobody in Ndola hears a thing. Rewind 16 months. In New York, a slight, precise Swedish diplomat runs the most impossible job on earth. Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations, is 56 years old, unmarried, austere, a mountaineer and a reader of medieval mystics. He believes the office he holds must answer to no great power. The crisis that kills him begins in the Congo. In June of 1960, Belgium hands over a territory the size of Western Europe after 80 years of brutal extraction. Within days, the army mutinies. Within a fortnight, the richest province, Katanga, declares itself an independent state. The new country is coming apart before its flag has faded. Katanga holds copper, cobalt, and uranium, and the mining companies that pull them from the ground do not intend to lose them. Moise Tshombe governs the breakaway province with Belgian money and European mercenaries at his side. Hammarskjöld sends in a United Nations force, the largest peacekeeping operation yet attempted. It is asked to keep order in a country with no order left. Then Patrice Lumumba, the Congo's first prime minister, is deposed, handed to his enemies in Katanga, and murdered in January of 1961. The news detonates across the world. Moscow accuses Hammarskjöld of complicity and demands he resign, proposing that his office be split 3 ways. He refuses and tells the assembly he will not desert the small nations who cannot defend themselves. By September of 1961, the Secretary General is a man with enemies in every direction. The Soviet bloc wants him gone. Mining interests and mercenary networks want him out of Katanga. Elements in Britain, Belgium, and the white settler governments of southern Africa regard the United Nations operation as a disaster. He flies to Leopoldville anyway. On the 13th of September, United Nations troops move against the Katangese gendarmerie in an operation codenamed Morthor. It is meant to be swift. Instead, it becomes a war. Indian and Irish soldiers fight through the streets of Elizabethville, and a company of Irishmen is surrounded at Jadotville and forced to surrender after days without water. Katanga has almost no air force. What it has is one small jet trainer, a Fuga Magister, flown by European pilots for hire. That single aircraft strafes United Nations positions, attacks a supply column, and grounds transport flights across the province. For several days in September, one jet holds air superiority over an entire war. Hammarskjöld decides the fighting must be stopped, face to face. A meeting is arranged with Tshombe on neutral ground. Ndola, a mining town across the border in northern Rhodesia, British territory. It is not a place where the United Nations has friends. He goes because he can see no other way to end it. The aircraft chosen is a Douglas DC-6B chartered from a Swedish company, registration SEDBY, named Albertina. 4 piston engines, a long range, a veteran Swedish crew. Days earlier, the same machine had come under fire in Katanga and been repaired. On the 17th of September, it sits at Leopoldville, refueled and waiting through the afternoon. In the late afternoon, the Secretary General boards with his party, aides, a Swedish crew of 6, and United Nations security officers, 16 souls in all. He carries a briefcase, and in it, a paperback of Martin Buber that he has been translating into Swedish. The doors close a little before 5 o'clock. The flight plan is a deception. Rather than fly the short line southeast across Katanga, where a jet is hunting, the Albertina strikes far out over the Indian Ocean and comes back at Ndola from the wrong direction. Radio silence is kept, no position reports. For nearly 7 hours, the aircraft simply does not exist. At Ndola, the night is warm and hazy, with smoke from bushfires drifting over the airfield. Chombe's delegation waits. So does the British High Commissioner, Lord Alport. A British minister who has flown in separately takes off again shortly before midnight, passing the incoming aircraft somewhere in the dark. Journalists doze in parked cars. Just after 10 past midnight, the tower hears the Albertina. The captain reports the lights of Ndola in sight. The tower passes the airfield pressure setting, and the pilot reads it back correctly. He confirms he is descending. The controller expects him to call again on final approach. Minutes pass. The tower calls and hears nothing. Somewhere out in the dark, 9 miles west-northwest of the runway, the aircraft has descended in a shallow left turn and gone into the trees. The nearest human beings are charcoal burners in the bush. Some of them will later say they saw 2 aircraft and a flash. Then comes the strangest part of the night. The airfield is not searched. Around 2 in the morning, the tower assumes the aircraft has diverted. The runway lights are switched off. The High Commissioner remarks that the Secretary General must have changed his mind and gone elsewhere, and goes to bed. An aircraft carrying the head of the United Nations is missing. Daylight comes at 6. A search is finally organized. Aircraft go up, and the ground parties spread out. It takes until the middle of the afternoon, more than 15 hours after the crash, to find a wreck lying 9 miles from the runway, on the approach path, in plain terrain. Local people had reportedly reached it long before. The site tells a plain story and a strange one at once. The aircraft struck the trees while level, wings almost even, undercarriage down. An aircraft flying in approach, simply far too low. There was no distress call, no fire before impact that anyone reported. 15 of the 16 aboard were dead. Hammarskjöld himself was found apart from the others, thrown clear, lying against an anthill at the edge of the burn, almost untouched by fire. Leaves had been gathered near him. In later years, a photograph would fuel a claim that a playing card had been tucked into his collar. The ace of spades. It has never been explained or disproved. One man was still alive. Sergeant Harold Julian, an American security officer, was pulled from the scrub with terrible burns. In hospital, drifting in and out of lucidity, he told those around him that there had been sparks in the sky and an explosion, and that the Secretary General had said, "Turn back." Julian's words were the only human testimony from inside the aircraft, and they were set aside. Investigators concluded he had been confused by shock and morphine. He was never formally interviewed by anyone from the United Nations before he died. The one witness the world had was allowed to slip away almost unquestioned. African witnesses fared no better. Charcoal burners and villagers near the crash line described a second, smaller aircraft above the airliner and flashes in the sky before the fire. In the Rhodesia of 1961, their statements were treated as unreliable almost by definition. Decades later, investigators would go back and find those accounts consistent and largely unexamined. The world reacted with something close to disbelief. Flags fell to half-mast. The Security Council sat in silence. In Washington, former President Harry Truman told reporters that Hammarskjöld was on the point of getting something done when they killed him, and added pointedly, "Note that I said when they killed him." He offered no evidence. Nobody asked for any. 3 inquiries followed within a year. A Rhodesian Board of Investigation, then a Rhodesian Commission, which found pilot error the most probable cause. A crew descending too low on a dark approach into terrain they could not see. Then the United Nations Commission of 1962, which examined the same evidence and refused to choose. The United Nations verdict was open. It could not exclude sabotage. It could not exclude attack from another aircraft. It could not exclude a mistake in the cockpit. 3 possibilities, no resolution, and a file closed for half a century. It remains the only death of a serving Secretary General in the organization's history. Consider the simplest explanation. The crew had flown a long, tense, roundabout flight and were tired. Ndola sits more than 4,000 feet above the sea, and a misread altimeter on a black, hazy night could put an aircraft into the trees on a perfect approach. It is an ordinary accident, and ordinary accidents kill great men. Consider the second. The Albertina had sat on a busy apron in Leopoldville for hours, under uncertain guard, in a country swarming with intelligence officers and men for hire. A device in the wheel bay, timed for the descent, would leave little trace in a fire that burned as hot as this one did. Consider the third. A jet was operating in the region that week, flown by European mercenaries. Years later, a former American naval officer stated publicly that at a listening post in Cyprus, he heard a recording of a pilot's voice describing a low transport aircraft and then a hit and flames. The recording, if it exists, has never been produced. In 1998, documents surfaced in South African archives describing a plot to bring down Hammarskjöld's aircraft with a charge in the wheel bay. They were examined, doubted, and widely judged to be forgeries. But even the forgers had chosen their method carefully, and no investigation has ever fully accounted for where the papers came from. In 2011, the historian Susan Williams published years of new research from Zambian and Western archives. A voluntary commission of senior jurists reviewed it and concluded there was enough to justify reopening the case. In 2015, more than 50 years after the crash, the General Assembly did exactly that. The panel appointed by the United Nations, led by the Tanzanian jurist Mohamed Chande Othman, has now reported repeatedly. Its finding is careful and damning, that it is plausible an external attack or threat caused the crash, and that the burden has shifted to the member states. Britain, the United States, and others, it says, almost certainly still hold undisclosed intercepts. The clearing near Ndola is quiet now. There is a low stone memorial where the anthill stood, and the trees have grown back over the scar. 16 people went into that ground in 11 seconds, and the answer to why is still sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, marked closed. Every year, the United Nations asks again. Every year, most of the doors stay shut.